Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Sister Mu'Mina, we are very happy to be talking to you today. And just to kind of get everything started, this is going to be an oral history interview with Sister Mu'Mina Ali in the historic West End community in Atlanta, Georgia. Today is July 28, 2013, and it's also the month of Ramadan. And my co-interviewer is?
Sis Muhammad. How are you, Sister Mu'Mina?
I'm doing well, alhamdulillah.
And for the record, I'm Zainab Ansari, and we're going to go ahead, inshallah, God willing, and just jump right into our questions for Sister Mu'Mina. And really, our first question is we'd like to hear about your story of becoming Muslim and also how you came to Atlanta.
I became Muslim. I took my Shahada in 1979. I was raised in a family who were God-fearing, but they weren't religious. But I spent a lot of my time with my grandmother, who was a devout Christian. And as a matter of fact, my mother used to say, you know, I spent more time with her than I did with my mom. But she was very devout. She was very God-conscious. She was very prayerful. And I became conscious at a very young age of Allah and that Allah was real. And I went to church with her and Sunday school and everything. And even from a young age, I didn't believe in what they were saying. It didn't make sense. I said I was, 7 years old, and I knew that 3 didn't equal 1. There's 3, the Trinity, and it's 1. No, 3 is not equal to 1. And I used to ask a lot of questions, and my Sunday school teacher really was perturbed by me, and she told me I'd understand everything when I got older. And I realized that this was not the way, that there was God, and He was over everything, but this was not the way. But I also realized that I was a small child, and I could not go out on my own and find the real way to worship Allah. And so I made a covenant with Allah when I was young. I said, I'm going to keep coming to church because these are the only people I know who are talking about you. But when I get to be an adult, you're going to show me the right way to worship you. And I met my husband in college, and he had come from a similar background and search for the way to worship Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he was a year ahead of me, so he graduated from college, and I was in my senior year, and he just happened to run into a Muslim. And the Muslims started giving him dawah. And so he calls me, and up at college, he said, listen, I ran into this Muslim, and this is what he told me. And then the Muslim gave him, literature, which he sent to me. And we spent hours on the phone just going through the literature, and we was like, this is it, this is it, this is it. Allah has sent this to us. And once I graduated, I took my Shahada. I took my Shahada the next year, as a matter of fact. And the reason there was a time lapse between me graduating and me taking my Shahada is because I wanted to make sure I was doing it fi sabilillah. Because by the time I graduated, my fiance had taken his Shahada. And I said, you know what? I don't want this to have anything to do with you, that I'm taking my Shahada because you're Muslim. I have to be able to worship Allah on my own. This is my relationship with God, and it has nothing to do with you. And as long as I think you have any influence on this, I'm not going to do it. And so after about a year, he moved to Atlanta. So I said, okay, he's gone. I'm never going to see him again. So now it's me and Allah. And I started going to the Islamic Center and started taking classes. And it was wonderful. At that time, they had a class it was a beginner's class, but it was a class for people who were new shahadas, people who had family members who were Muslim and wanted to learn more about the religion, or people who were just investigating the religion on their own. So it wasn't intimidating at all. So I started going there to, learn about Islam, and the more I learned about Islam, the more I knew in my heart that this is the way, and I took my Shahada. And I continue, I learned my fundamental classes there.
What year was this?
That was in 1979. That was in 1979.
1979. And can you tell us about the community and the neighborhood? What city was this?
I lived in Philadelphia at this time, and Philadelphia has always, had lots of Muslims and lots of masajids. It has just been a place where Islam has flourished. And it was funny because the masjid that my husband took his Shahada in was in West Philadelphia. And I called them the, like the militant Muslims, and I wasn't as comfortable there. Whereas I took my Shahada, it was called the Islamic Center. It was on Broad Street. It was in downtown Philadelphia. And they just had a mix of people, of immigrants, college. It was near Temple University. So they had all people from all over who came there. Professional people and people who I was more comfortable with. And so I took my Shahada there. But there were many, even at that time, there were quite a few masjids in Philadelphia. And even now when I go back to visit Philly, Philly is like Muslim city. Every street you see Muslims, you see Muslim restaurants, you see masajids, you see in the supermarket, on my Facebook page, my background picture is the halal section of the supermarket. You go into the supermarket, like a Kroger's, they have a halal section of meat. When you go to the deli section, they have a cutter that says halal meat only. There's a section where you can buy hijabs and kufis and Islamic art in the supermarket because there's so many Muslims in Philadelphia now. So it's like you go there and you go like, I'm in Muslim city, But that's where I took my Shahada. And a lot of people always ask, do you know sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so? And I'm like, well, no, because right after I took my Shahada, I moved to Atlanta. So I only met a few Muslims there that I connected with, that I still have relationships with.
To backtrack, growing up in Philadelphia, because you're talking about Philadelphia when you embraced Islam in the late 1970s and how there was an active Muslim presence. But growing up, so as a child, did you encounter Muslims, African American Muslims, members of the Nation of Islam, for example? Were there immigrant Muslims? Or was Islam,
When I grew up in Philadelphia, I grew up in the outskirts of Philly. It wasn't the suburbs, but right where my neighborhood was the city line. And the area that I grew up in was a Jewish neighborhood. It's really strange. My first 10 years of my life, I lived in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And then my parents moved, and we moved into a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And which very quickly became a predominantly African-American neighborhood as the Jewish people moved en masse out of the neighborhood. We were the second African-American family to move into that neighborhood, and I was in 5th grade. By the time I was out of middle school, it was predominantly African-American. So in 4 years, thousands of people moved. Okay, but so I wasn't in the city, and so I wasn't in the city, so I was sort of, in a protected little environment. But my cousin was part of the nation. My cousin became part of the nation, and she used to come through, and I loved the change that came over her as part of the nation, because she struggled a lot with different issues, and I loved it. I loved the clothing, I loved the scarves, I loved the, the white and white and white, and so she told me a lot about the nation, and I admired a lot of what they did. And when I was in middle school, I actually read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I just happened to just pick it off a bookshelf and read it, and I was like totally fascinated by it. But I just did not, because I also knew of some negative things that were going on within the nation, and through my cousin's husband, who had a totally different job in the nation, I'm like, no, this is God, and this is how you're mixing two different things. You're doing all these positive things, but then there's all these negative things. So I said, no, that's not for me. But I saw such positiveness in it. I was like, it was really great, but I just knew, no, that's not my way either.
And when you became Muslim, you said it was during college, and which school did you go to, and what was the Muslim presence like on campus?
When I became Muslim, it was the year after I graduated from college, but when I went to Shippensburg, it's now called Shippensburg State University, but it was Shippensburg State College in the middle of Pennsylvania, in the mountains of Pennsylvania. It was is a predominantly white university, and it was funny because they were trying to, get African Americans to come, and every year they would be like 100 students, and by the end of the year there'd be 100 students because so many people would leave or flunk out. And so I really don't remember any Muslims there. I'm sure they were, But I don't remember. My first really interaction with Muslims was after I graduated, and I was in Philly, and I was searching for a way to worship Allah.
Now, you mentioned that there was a masjid that your fiance, who became your husband, that he went to a masjid that was they're a little bit militant.
Yeah.
And my question for you is, this is like late 1970s, so we're going to,
Hmm.
in end of 70s, early 80s, and that was a time when the Nation of Islam had really kind of made a transition from being the Nation of Islam to actually being Sunni Muslim. But do you recall, though, during that time, was there any tension between groups who identified as Sunni Muslim and the Nation of Islam in the Philadelphia context?
Well, in Philadelphia at that time, like I said, there were many different Muslim groups. There were the Ahmadiyas, there were those who practiced the Sunnah, there was the Nation of Islam, there were those that were making the transition. But I really was not involved in that. I was really at that time involved in learning my salat, learning some surahs, and just learning the fundamentals. So I really was not involved. I got to know a few sisters in the West Philadelphia Masjid, and I ended up going there once I got to know some sisters and helping out with different fundraising events and what have you, and just talking to some sisters I felt comfortable with. But within a year, I was gone. I was in Atlanta, so my presence in Philadelphia was not one that was long.
Now, let's talk about Atlanta. So when you came to Atlanta, what was the initial reason? Would you describe moving to Atlanta as sort of continuing your journey into Islam, or was it more for reasons of starting a family? I'd like to hear more about that.
I moved to Atlanta because the man I was going to marry was in Atlanta. He had moved to Atlanta. It was really strange. One day he said, he called me, he said, I'm thinking about moving. I think I need to find a place where there's a Muslim community, a physical Muslim community, where there's the masjid and people live around the masjid and people know each other. And so he started researching, and the only one he found was the one in Atlanta. And it didn't hurt that Imam Jamil Al-Amin was the imam there, because he had a lot of respect from his days in the civil rights movement as H. Rap Brown. So he just felt Allah just was sending him here. And so he came to Atlanta, and he loved the community in the West End. And so he moved to Atlanta in the spring of '79. I took my Shahada in the summer of '79, and we got married in the fall of '79. So that meant that, unless I was going to have a long distance marriage, I had to move to Atlanta. Although I didn't move to Atlanta for another 2 years, I sort of commuted back and forth. That's how I ended up here, because he came here. And when I first came here, because I got married at the masjid, and I had never been in the South before. And first of all, I said, this is the city of Atlanta. Where are the buildings? I mean, to me, a city was like Philadelphia, row homes and lots of office buildings and like all these trees, all this grass. What is this? And so it took a minute for me to get used to being in a different environment. But I loved the community. I loved, we actually lived in the apartment right next door to this Islamic center. And at the time when I moved here, just to show you how, Allah's qadr is just so magnificent. When I moved here, my husband had one of the apartment building next door. He had an apartment there. This was a motorcycle club. This building was a motorcycle club. It is where drugs were sold. It was where all kinds of things were sold. I mean, you come out and you see them in their black leather and their motorcycle and all of that. And I used to and there was a store next to us also. And I used to run to the store and look at the motorcycle people and go, oh my God, Allah, please protect us, please protect us. And years later, we own this building. We've turned it into an Islamic center where Islam is taught. And we'd have never thought back then that was going to be the end, the end, how this building was going to end up. So it was, just a wonderful experience.
Now, I wanted to go back to prior to you moving to Atlanta with your husband and you converting to Islam. Aside from your husband's conversion, considering all the different perspectives, Islamic perspectives in Philadelphia with the Ahmadiyyanis, you
Mhm.
said, and the Sunni and the nation, I was wondering what drew you towards the Sunni perspective.
When I was studying about Islam, and the literature that I had about Islam was about Islam. It wasn't about any movement in Islam. It wasn't about any sect in Islam. It was just Islamic literature. And so it wasn't until, I had experience with the nation, but it wasn't until I took my Shahada that I realized there were all these different groups. And when people say, well, what are you? And I said, I'm Muslim. I'm Muslim. I said, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. I believe in the 5 pillars and the Iman and and there is nothing else other than being Muslim. So the literature that I got and the information I got was just on Islam. It was not perpetuating or promoting any one system. It was just dawah. And so that's why I was never part of any other group. I just always considered myself Muslim, and the purity of Islam that was brought to me. By the time I learned about the groupings, it was like, I don't need to be a part of any of these groups. I just need to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I need to be amongst people who worship Allah. The end.
How did your decision, how was it received by your family when you became Muslim?
When I became Muslim, that was really strange. My family has always been supportive of me, but when I first became Muslim, my mom said, it's because of that guy, it's because of that man, I'm not going to say anything because in a year or so, she'll be over it, she'll go back to, who she was. But my mother also said, and this is always something I always kept in my heart, when I became Muslim, she said to me, listen, I know about Islam through the Nation of Islam. And people who become Muslim, I've known of people who became Muslim in jail and people who had a hard life who became Muslim, and Islam turned them around. So it's a good religion. It's a good religion because it makes bad people into good people. But you're already good, you don't need it. And so that was her perspective. You're already good, so you don't really need it. It's for people who are bad and they need to be good. And so that was her perspective. So she had a very good perspective on Islam. And so, and as the time wore on, she saw that, I was really committed. And my parents, they were always very, very, very supportive. Like when we used to go and visit, I would take my children to visit every summer. And my mom would say, okay, when are you coming? Because I have to get all of the haram meat out of my refrigerator, and I have to go get some Muslim meat. And so she would go to the halal meat store and get halal meat so that the only meat that would be in her refrigerator would be halal meat. I said, well, Mom, you can just buy that meat all the time. No, I'm not Muslim. I only need the Muslim meat when you guys come. And so, and when my daughters, as they got older and before she would buy something for them, she said, I'm going to buy the girls this. Can they wear it? So she was always very, very supportive. She was always very respectful. She would come down to Atlanta to visit, and she loved what she saw. She loved the protection of the brothers, and although she was very disappointed that I graduated from college and decided to become a housewife, something that, she sent me to college so I wouldn't have to be a housewife, so I can be a professional woman. And I got a job out of college in corporate America, AT&T, at the beginning of the computer boom, and I was right in there, and I was making lots of money. And for me to give all that up to have babies, she's like, ah. But other than that, she said she loved that the brothers took care of their wives, that they worked, that the women really didn't have to work, and the focus on family, because my mom was very family oriented. She loved the respect that she saw. As a matter of fact, later, many years later, as children of her friends became Muslim, she sort of used us as her measurement as to what good Muslims were. She said, oh yeah, my friend Janice, her son's a Muslim, but he's not a real Muslim because he has a girlfriend. And oh, my friend so-and-so, her daughter's a Muslim, but she takes that scarf on and off, not like you do in Atlanta. And so she actually, I told my husband, I said, she actually uses us, I said, alhamdulillah, as a measurement of how to practice Islam. And so she would judge other Muslims by the Muslims she met in Atlanta. So my family was very, very supportive.
And that that's really awesome, because you had you're describing a lot of really major life changes, embracing a new faith tradition, and after graduating school, and then being in corporate America, and then coming to Atlanta to get married. And I want to talk more about what you found coming to Atlanta versus Philadelphia. You mentioned growing up, you kind of saw white flight in action as the neighborhood, the
Yeah.
demographics of your neighborhood changed. When you came to Atlanta, what was the demographic makeup of the neighborhood you settled in?
I moved to Atlanta to the West End, and the West End was predominantly at that time African American. But there were always a few people from other races, other ethnicities here. And a lot of times people say, oh, when they think of a black neighborhood, they think it's monolithic. But I love the West End because we had the Shrine of the Black Madonna, something I had never known about before. We had the Hebrew Israelites, and I'm like, black Jews, black Catholics. We had the regular churches. We had, I call them the Afrocentric people, and I say, so we had all of these, although when you came and you drove through and you looked at it, you saw predominantly African American, but there was just so many different variations, so many different belief systems here. Also, I love the West End because it wasn't, I was here for about 15 years before my children informed me that I lived in the hood. And I'm like, what do you mean I live in the hood? I don't live in the hood. What are you talking about? I know what the hood is. I see the hood on TV. I don't live in the hood. And she's like, we live in the hood. I'm like, no, we don't. And they said, what do you think it is? I said, this is a community. There have always been professional people who lived in the West End, doctors and lawyers and people of wealth. And there have always been working class people here, and there's always been very poor people here. And I love the mix. I wanted my children, I didn't want them to grow up in an affluent neighborhood. We could have moved out to the suburbs and anything like that. But we moved here for them to have the Muslim community. But also, I wanted them to see the diversity, that I don't want you to think that everyone is wealthy or everyone is poor. They got to see and become friends and experience all the different levels, economic levels, right here where they lived. They got to see all different faiths right here where they lived. They got to hear the adhan 5 times a day right here where they lived. Our non-Muslim neighbors greeted us with the adhan. They would tell us that the adhan woke them up for work. I had a young lady that I worked with briefly, and she said, I used to hate the Muslims for a long time. And I said, why? And she said, because I live with my grandmother, and when they called the adhan for Fajr, my grandmother would wake us all up and say, if the Muslims can pray, we can pray. So get up and pray. And they were Christian. And she said, we had to get up and pray Fajr every morning, and we weren't Muslim. So, so it was that type of environment. Our non-Muslim neighbors came to Imam Jamil for help. He had a community store. He would give them food on credit. I remember an elderly lady came over and said, Imam Jamil, my grandson's acting up. Can you talk to him? And he's like, yeah, bring him over here. And Imam Jamil was 6 foot something, very imposing and intimidating. He told, your grandmother told me you're not doing well in school and I don't want to have to come and talk to you, and so on and so forth. So our neighbors, we were very interactive with our neighbors. It wasn't a thing that, was this Muslim community and we were a part of the West End community. And our neighbors loved us and we loved them and we interacted with them. And so to me, the West End was a wonderful place. Like I said, the only thing I had to get used to is, number one, the southernism of it, the trees, the environment. And then also, just the language, I found out they didn't speak English in Atlanta. No, I'm talking about, I'm going to the store, I'm like, oh my God, what are they saying? Oh my God, what are they saying? And I used to ask my husband, what language are they speaking? He said, they're speaking English. And I'm like, no, they're not. And it took me a while to realize in listening that the Atlanta dialect, they leave off the ends of words. So it's not store, it's sto. It's not mother, it's mom. So if you can catch that first syllable and figure out what the last syllable is, you understand. So I started understanding what they were saying. But for the longest time, I was like, I live in a foreign country because I don't understand the language. So And that's one of the reasons why when I had my children, we started our own school, because I said, I will not have my children go to Atlanta public schools and then have to learn English as a second language, because their natural language will be that stuff done talking like that. And so I didn't want them to talk like that. And they knew they better not talk like that. So I said, let me teach them. And so then when they go on to public school, if they go on to public school, then they will have English as a first language and will not have to learn English in school.
That's, I think, a really good transition for my question about Islamic education in Atlanta. So tell me about the West End School. What was the name of the school? What year did it get started? What were your students like? And tell me a little bit about the vision behind that school.
We started the West End Islamic Primary School in 1982. I want to say 82, yes, because my daughter was 2 years old. Yeah, 1982. It may have been 83. A few sisters and I were talking about the fact that we wanted our children to have the preschool experience, but we weren't willing to send them to non-Muslim preschools. And at the time, there were none. And so we decided, so we would say, well, we're going to homeschool our children. So it was me, Sister Kanza Abdul-Rabbani, and Sister Nanika Abdul-Rahman. And we decided, well, we're all going to do this. Let's do it as a collective. Let's do like a homeschool collective, a cooperative. And so we decided to do that, and we used Sister Kanza's house. And, you know, we let the community know that this is what we're going to do. And everybody's like, oh, we all have 2, 3, 4-year-olds. We want to send them. And we asked the parents to contribute as they could. You know, if you wanted to make food, if you wanted to work with art, you wanted to do this and do that. And so that first year, we had our preschool. It was really a preschool. And after the first year, the parents said, you know what? You 3 are really good at this and you seem to enjoy it. We don't want to be here with our kids. We'll pay you. And we never thought of it as something as, you know, a way of making money. We just thought we need to educate our children, and we're not going to send them into any un-Islamic environments. We're not going to send them anywhere outside of our community until they know the fundamentals of their faith. And so, so the next year, we had our Islamic, it was called the West End Islamic Primary School, and it was the 3 of us, and we ran the school, and we came up with a curriculum. We actually, we went to different preschools in the area, and there were lots of preschools here. There was Harambe Institute, and there were all these different schools that had a, I want to say a theme, but something that they wanted to teach their kids. You know, whether it was from the African heritage or you know, art, or there were all these different specific preschools in the West End. And so we went there and they invited us in. They said there could never be enough educational facilities for our children. And they would tell us, you know, what we needed to do, and, you know, gave us advice to where we could go to get supplies and what have you. At the time, they had a place called the school, I'm trying to think, Atlanta School Depository. And in this building, they had all of the major textbook publishers. And you can actually go from textbook publisher and look at their books. And so we spent like days just going through all of the textbooks of all of the publishers and deciding which ones went with our curriculum, which ones we could use, which ones we were comfortable with. And so we got that. And like I said, we were mentored by a lot of the other preschools in this area. And so when we started our preschool, we had done a lot of research, and we decided what we wanted to do, and we just started the preschool. And then what happened was our first set of children were now kindergarten age. And so the first set of children actually went to Claire Muhammad School. So we sent them from our preschool to Claire Muhammad Schools. And we talked about, okay, is this what we want to do, or do we want to continue? And so then we decided we added a kindergarten. And when we added the kindergarten, we kicked the 2-year-olds out. And then we added the first grade, and then we realized, okay, this is going to be a school. And so we said, well, we need a building, because we went from Sister Kanza's house. After the second year, she decided she didn't want to do it anymore. So it was Nanika and I. And so we moved it to my house. And so then we found a building. I mean, it was a house. It was being foreclosed upon. It was in dire condition. And our husbands bought it for us. You know, Brother Jabri Abdul Rahman and Imam Nadim, they purchased the building. And my husband worked, he worked double shifts. And he would come home and go into that building and put up walls and ceilings and, you know, and like maybe get 2 hours sleep before Fajr, then go back to work. But over a period of months, we got the building ready. And so when school started that next year, we moved into that building. Oh, I skipped one. We actually, before we moved into that building, the imam had a little building behind his house. And it had 2 rooms and 2 bathrooms in it. And I guess it was an in-law suite or something, but they didn't use it, and it was sort of dilapidated and what have you, because he really didn't care about it, and he was thinking about tearing it down. And so when we first moved into that building, we rehabbed that building, and we moved into that building, and we had the boys in one room and the girls in the other room, and so we taught all the different levels at the same time. But then we realized we needed a bigger space, and that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right across the street, the building became available. So here we are, still in our community. The masjid is here. 3 houses down is the school. Across the street is the imam. You know, so it was just like Allah just made all of this happen. And so once we got the building, we rehabbed the building, and we moved into the building. And we went up through 5th grade. Sometimes we went to 6th grade, depending on whether or not the students were able to get into another school, and parents would say, please, please teach my child one more year, please. And I couldn't say no. But we wanted them to know the basics of Islam. We wanted them to know the basics of Islam. We wanted them to get an excellent academic foundation, but also get an Islamic foundation. And we taught them their salat. We taught them the pillars of Islam. We taught them the hadith. We taught them the adab of you know, giving salams and how you treat each other. And I remember teaching Islamic studies to my 4th and 5th graders. And I taught 4th and 5th. Another sister taught 2nd and 3rd, and Sister Nanika taught kindergarten and 1st. So, and the way I taught Islamic studies, we were learning about the prophets, and we would go to the Quran, and I said, go to the index and find every place in the Quran this prophet is mentioned. Then we're going to read everything, and you're going to make notes. I said, because the story is spread out. I said, if you want to learn the story of the prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, you cannot read it from one surah. You're going to have to read all the different times the story is mentioned, and then we're going to compile it. And that's how they learned about the prophets. You know, so we would compile the story from all the different ayahs in the Quran. And then I said, now that you have all the facts, write the story. You know, so it was a very exciting time because the kids internalized it. They lived it. I mean, when they called the adhan for Dhuhr, we got them in a row. We marched down to the masjid, and they made salat at the masjid. You know, they grew up in the masjid. They grew up in a Muslim community. They grew up very, very aware that they were Muslims, but it wasn't about being different. And I would meet other children who grew up in neighborhoods that were predominantly non-Muslim, and they would come to the West End, and they were like, you know, when I'm not around my parents, you know, I have to take this off because I have to live in my neighborhood. I have to live in my school. And our children never had to. They were very self-assured, you know, about their Islam. You know, their Islam. I remember when my daughter was in college and she was doing job interviews, and I said, well, did they ask you about, you know, your hijab or anything like that? She's like, Umi, why would they ask me about that? Like, well, I'm just wondering, you know, if they ask you. They should be judging me on my qualifications. They better not ask me about my hijab. And I realized at that point that was so a part of her that she couldn't see why I would even ask the question as to why there would be a question about it, because what does that have to do with me as a professional? You know, this is who I am. And so it never dawned on her that that was something different outside of the norm, because that was her norm. She grew up in a Muslim community, and that was just who she was. So the school came about because we wanted to make sure our children had a great foundation in Islam. and they would, you know, they knew the basics before they went anywhere else. And for me and my family, after my children left the West End primary school, I sent them to other Muslim schools because I wanted them to now learn that there are other Muslims who practice different than you do. We all doing the, you know, we're all Muslims, but they practice differently. Like some of my children went to Claire Muhammad and WD. Some of my kids went to Dar Noor, and they had different experiences. But you have to stand up for your belief system amongst Muslims who practice a little differently. Okay, and then after that, we sent them to public school. We sent them to North Atlanta High School, which was the international school. So now that you're really strong, now you have to be able to stand up as a Muslim amongst non-Muslims. So it was sort of progression as to what we did with them, because we wanted them to be firm in faith, and we wanted them to be comfortable in their faith and not always be different, you know. And it's funny because I've been posting on a sister on her Facebook, and she was talking about being a convert and always being amongst immigrant communities, and she's finally gotten a sense of, I'm an American Muslim and I'm an African American Muslim, and I'm not from this culture or this culture or this culture, and so everyone, you're going to now have to accept me as I am because I'm now comfortable in my skin. And different people responded to that, and so I responded and said, that has never been a problem with me, because I was never in an immigrant community or a community in which I wasn't comfortable, or a community that wasn't like me. And Imam Jamil, you know, one of my favorite quotes from him is every Muslim ain't an Arab and every Arab ain't a Muslim. And so he gave us good self-esteem, you know, that, you know, we are able to lead ourselves. We are able to teach ourselves. We have respect for everyone who has knowledge, but we don't need anyone to come in here and teach us like there's something wrong with us. And back during that time, people thought he was quite arrogant, because of course you need someone from Yemen or Saudi or somewhere to come over here and teach you, you know, you converts. And he's like, whatever books we have, we'll learn. And as we get more knowledge, if we learned anything wrong, we'll relearn that, you know, and we'll have classes, but we don't need you to lead us, because the sunnah is the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to send his emissaries out to people who became Muslim, he used to say, teach them their religion, but leave their leadership alone. The leadership should be from amongst them. And so I never had any self-esteem issues as a Muslim, that I had to be more Arab or more Pakistani or more anything, because Imam Jamil said, you're African American Muslim, and that will suffice before Allah as long as you're righteous. That Allah is going to judge you on your righteousness, not on how much Arabic you speak or how much Quran you can read in Arabic. As long as what you learn, you put into practice, that is the most important thing. So if you know this much and you do this much, Allah will be pleased with you. And you may know all of the Quran and not practice any of it, Allah is not going to be pleased with you. So it was, for me, to me, I think that was one of the greatest blessings that Allah gave me coming up as a Muslim in the West End community, because of the self-sufficiency, because of the self-esteem, because Imam Jamil was very, very strict about practicing the Islam. That was number one, you know, making your salat. You know, the sisters, when I came here, classes every Sunday. Every Sunday for sisters, we had classes. We had Arabic class, Quran class, Islamic studies class at the masjid. There was no even thought of not going to those classes. As I had one child and I take my baby to the class, okay, two. By the time I had three, I told myself, well, maybe I shouldn't go to the class. I'll keep the babies, or, you know, one of the sisters in the back will keep all the children. But it was just almost mandatory. Husbands demanded that their wives go to the masjid on Sunday to learn their Islam. That you're not here to learn your Islam from me, you know. And the sisters would come together, and the one with the most knowledge would teach. And then if we found other sisters, like we had, I remember one time a sister from Egypt came and she taught us, and we had sisters from all over who came in and taught us. But it was something that we did, and the sisterhood was really tight, because we came together and we learned together, and we had our questions together, and any problems we had, we talked over with one another, you know. And so it was just a wonderful experience. And I see a lot of the young adult sisters now, they talk, and I listen to them talking, and they're like, we're not apart, you know. I don't want to call it, I call it masjid hopping. You know, for 1 year I was over in this masjid, and then this happened, I didn't like it, so now my family's here, and, you know, and I'm not liking this and that. You have to root yourself in community. There's no place that's going to be perfect. Jannah is perfect, okay? Paradise is perfect. There's no human-made facility on this earth that's going to be perfect. But you root yourself in community, and you help it to grow. And if there's something you don't like, then you try to change it. But if you go from place to place to place trying to find utopia, then you find that you haven't really committed, and you haven't really changed, and you haven't really made any type of benefit to anyone. And so, and that's one thing I always tell people: find the community that you're most comfortable with. You're not going to like everything there, but stay there and help it to grow. You know, and so, but for me, the West End was that place, and I was very happy here. And my children, I have 5 children who are Muslim, and they still practice their deen, and I'm just very blessed.
Now, you've talked about community as being really one of the driving forces behind why Imam Nadim came down to Atlanta, and you know, and then of course you moved and you know started a family here, and that it really, the idea of masjid, imam's house, you know, school, that really appealed to you. And you know, I guess my question is, the community in the West End, you know, this is obviously a really historic neighborhood to begin with, you know, but these days we hear a lot, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the news about Muslims want to build a masjid, people come out and protest,
Mm-hmm.
you know, these sorts of stories. What was the response of the neighborhood when the masjid was established, the school was built, the stores were opened? Was there any sense of, okay, the neighbors don't want us here? Any of that tension that we hear about a lot, especially after 9/11?
There was really no tension in the West End when we settled here, when we started the school, started Muslim businesses, El Fajr, the community store. Our neighbors actually felt that we were a positive presence. And I read a lot about how Imam Jamil and the Muslims rid the neighborhood of drugs and what have you. And I really don't know about that, because that's not something I had any knowledge of, you know, that there was, other than the motorcycle club here, as far as the drug activity or what have you in the West End. But I'm sure that is true. But the Muslims, the brothers, they had sutra every night. And I told you my husband worked double shifts, and he would come home and he would sleep, and he would have the 3 to 5 shift for sutra. And so he would have to get up, and it's like the neighborhood watch. The Muslim brothers would do a neighborhood watch from like midnight until Fajr. And so all the brothers, they took turns. They had a slot where they had to go out and they walked the neighborhood. They drove the neighborhood. I remember one time my husband told me of a drug dealer who had moved into the neighborhood, and they noticed it. And what the brothers would do is they would go and stand out on the sidewalk in front of his house. And so when cars would pull up to, you know, they want to stop to go in and buy some drugs, there would be these 3 Muslim brothers just standing. I remember one time going to Greenbrier Mall, and one of the salespersons asked me, "Are you a Muslim?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Are you part of the community near the Muslims who live near the West End Park?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "I love driving through there. I tell my friends all the time, it's this community right in the middle of Atlanta, in a neighborhood that most people would think is unsafe. And when you get around the area where the Muslims live, it's like a patch of the suburbs, a patch of suburban life in the middle of the city." He said the kids are riding their bikes up and down the street, they're skating, people are walking down the street, they're talking. She says, it's like you're in the middle of the suburbs, but you're actually in the middle of an urban area in the city. And she said, "I love driving through that area because the Muslims make it so safe." And so this was just further validation as to, this is someone who didn't even live in the West End, but their comment, you know, was that they could see that when you came through the West End, there was a certain spot where things changed, you know, where the whole atmosphere and environment changed. And they said it was due to the Muslims, and that's the way our neighbors felt. So there was no animosity. I was part of the WIND, which is the West End Neighborhood Association. I was the secretary. And someone came, and they had just moved into the neighborhood. And they said, I think someone has a loudspeaker on top of a building, because every so often I hear something that comes over the loudspeaker. And I knew they were talking about the adhan coming from the masjid. And before I could say anything, my non-Muslims neighbors jumped up. Oh, that's the masjid. That's the call to prayer. It's called 5 times a day. It only lasts a minute or so, so it's not long. Oh, that's part of the. And so they each jumped up to explain what it was. So I never had to say anything, and it is part of our community, and it's part of the fabric of the West End, and we love our Muslims. And I sat there and I was chuckling to myself because the guy was like, what? There's one Muslim lady up there, she could have explained it, but no, all of my non-Muslim neighbors who were on the WIN committee, they explained what that loudspeaker on top of that house was that he really didn't understand. So the West End has really accepted us, and I remember after 9/11 having conversations with people all over the country, and particularly having a conversation with my daughter because, everyone was afraid of what was going to happen. And I told her, I said, Allah can turn this thing around. I said, don't let your fear grab a hold of you. Let's wait and see what happens. I said, and she says, well, a lot of sisters are taking off the hijab and so on because they don't want to be identified in case, someone's going to attack them. And what do you think I should do? And I said, I can't tell you what to do. I said, I'm not where you are. And you're going to have to make that decision for yourself. What I'm going to say to you is wait and see. And then if certain things happen to the point that you feel in danger, then that might be something you'll have to do. Or you may need to come home. I said, but now's not the time to do that. She said, well, what are you doing? I said, if something's going to happen to me, I want to die in uniform, so I'm not taking this off. I said, plus, I am not at any risk. I said, if anyone comes up into the West End trying to start some mess, we're going to come get the Muslims. I said, my non-Muslim neighbors, they have to get past my neighbor. I said, you're not going to mess with the Muslims. No, you're not, And so I said, I have the library here, the Kroger here, the Western Mall. I don't have to leave my hood. And the people in my neighborhood would protect me, Muslim or non-Muslims. I said, so I feel no fear. I said, now, I understand Muslims who are living further out where they're the only ones or they're only a few, they might feel some fear from their neighbors or they're not quite sure what they're thinking. Our neighbors we don't know what happened up in New York, but we got your back. So I never felt any fear after 9/11 because we were so entrenched in the fabric of this neighborhood. When you read Surah Ma'un and it tells us about seeing to our neighborly needs, our neighbors knew us. My husband in the khutbah on Friday mentioned that, your neighbors are 40 houses in any direction. And so our neighbors in the West End, they knew us. And so there was never any tension, and I never felt any fear. And post 9/11, I never felt any fear. And going back to the story of my daughter, what happened, Allah, just showing you Allah's mercy and grace. She worked in North Carolina, and where she worked, it was basically, what do you call them? People who had been in the army before, okay? So old military men. And once 9/11 happened, they came up to her and said, listen, we don't know anything about Islam, but we do know we've watched you for the year you worked here, and we know whatever happened in New York has nothing to do with Islam by your example of what a Muslim is. But we know our people, and we know they might get a little crazy. So if you need us to escort you home, we will. And somebody else said, we live in the next subdivision down from you. My wife and I will come and take you shopping. And the lady said, I live upstairs from you. If you ever hear anything, noise or anything, you can come up and stay with me. So at that time, when she was feeling a little fear, all of these people who were not Muslim came to her and said, we will protect you. And so I said, see, your character showed through. You gave dawah by your presence. When it was Ramadan and they would have meetings, they would not have the food until after it was time to break fast because they knew she was fasting. and things like that. So the dawah that we give out by our practice of our Islam, they see it. They see our example and they understand this is a good person. So all these crazy things are contradictory to what I see in this person. And that's one thing she found out, because all of these people, ex-Army, Navy, SEALs, say, we know our people. They might try to do something to you, so we're going to protect you because you are a good person. And this has nothing to do with you.
What city was this in?
Cary, North Carolina, I believe.
The West End community, as you've said, it was just, the Muslim community in the West End has been such a fabric, you said it's part of the fabric of the West End neighborhood. Our history goes back to late 50s, early 60s, with Temple number 15, for example. And then Al Farouk says, well, we got started in 1980 or so. And Imam Nadim says, no, actually, we're the first masjid. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what do you view as being the first masjid in Atlanta?
I think Atlanta Masjid, or whatever was the precursor to Atlanta Masjid, was first. The nation was here first, and what they evolved into. So I consider that one. I don't consider them separate. So they were here first, and then the West End community, and then El Farouk, because I remember El Farouk starting. So if I remember El Farouk starting, I was already a part of the West End when El Farouk started. So it was like, 1, 2, 3. And for the longest time, it was those three masajid. And you did not cross tribal lines. If you were in the West End, you did not go to Atlanta Masjid, you did not go to El Farouk. If you were El Farouk, you did not go to Atlanta Masjid, you did not go to West End. If you were in Atlanta Masjid, it was like strict lines of demarcation that you did not cross. And I was like, this is crazy. What is going on here? And so I couldn't understand it. I remember at the time the people from Atlanta Masjid calling us Arabized Muslims because we wore hijab and jilbab and what have you. And they were the American Muslim mission or something. We're American Muslims, and and we say, well, we wear, khimars because we're supposed to cover, and like, well, da 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 da. So there was a little debate going on there, and I just used to think that's just nonsense, because what separates us is ridiculous. What type of clothing we want to wear. But then also there was that history that was strong there, coming from the nation and making that transition. People who had that history, that foundation, that same history, we were different. And so they didn't trust us. And so we were different. And then we who did not have that history and maybe felt a little superior because, we came straight to the Sunnah, did put up barriers also. And then there was El Farouk, which was predominantly immigrant. And that was an issue. That was an issue because we as converts had, come into Islam, that Islam was holistic, it was pluralistic, that we are all one people. And we internalized that we are all one people. And so when the immigrant Muslims started coming in mass to Atlanta, and we found out they did not accept us. They did not accept us at all. We had a teacher at our school, Sister Amal, and she was Egyptian. And I always asked Amal, how did you find your way to the West End? Because she was part of El Farouk Masjid. And she said someone just happened to mention there was a school in the West End who needed an Arabic teacher. And at the time, she spoke no English. So she is now so fluent in English. I said, Amal, I remember when you didn't speak any English, but she came and she became our Arabic teacher. And she was our Arabic teacher and Quran teacher for many, many years. And many times she would have us come over to her house. She lived, her husband was going to Georgia Tech, and they were an integral part of El Farouk Masjid. And she would have, little social events for sisters, because she wanted the sisters there to meet us and see that we were good Muslims. And we would get there, and the women would speak all Arabic, and Amal would ask them to speak English because they could speak English fluently. And they wouldn't speak English, they wouldn't talk to us, they turned their back, and she would get so hurt. And she would be telling them in Arabic, "You're wrong, these are good Muslims, and you're treating them incorrectly," and what have you. And she would apologize to us, and we say, "It's all right, Amal." She said, "No, it's not all right. This is not Islam. This is not Islam." And I said, "But you're doing your best, and they're not ready." And so I said, "But if you could do me one favor, ask them, why they won't have anything to do with us." And she asked them and got really upset. And I said, "Okay, Amal, we can take it. We just want to know the why." And they said because their husbands told them that African Americans, stay away from African Americans because all the men were drug dealers and all the women were prostitutes. And so they had nothing to do with us. And many times over the years, she said, "Okay, things have changed. These things are different. We have some African Americans within El Farouk, and, they know, da, 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 da." And she would get together a group of sisters, and the same thing would happen over and over again. And it hurt her so much. And I said, "Amal, you have to stop this because it's hurting you. And we understand discrimination, and they're going to have to get used to being here as opposed to their country. And they're going to have to learn that what this attitude is wrong." And she says, "I can't stop this because Allah wouldn't be pleased with me if I stopped trying to show them that they're wrong." And for all the years she was with us, she'd always tried to do that thing of getting us together. And that was when I first realized that Muslims from other countries might not accept us. We thought we were Muslim, we were Muslim, we were Muslim, we were Muslim, we were part of the whole Ummah around the world. And then we go to El Farouk and find out, you're something, but you're not of us. And so that was a difficult time. I think that was a difficult time for in the history of Islam in Atlanta. And I think it's because of the different backgrounds. You had the immigrants who had their cultural background. You had Atlanta Masjid who had their cultural background from the Nation of Islam. You had those of us who came through the Sunnah who had our cultural background. And so that cultural background made many, many barriers. But for those who saw that it was something that was un-Islamic and they kept trying to cross the barriers, I see now that I hear a lot of you said, "Oh, we're still separate," but you don't know separation. Back then we were separate. Now, my children grew up knowing children all over the Atlanta area. They have friends who are Somalian American and Palestinian American and African American, European American. They have friends from Atlanta Masjid, from El Farouk, from Masjid Al Hidayah and all that. So this generation of children we raised got to know each other. And inshallah, our grandchildren, your children, will even be more inclusive because they will realize that all of this stuff doesn't matter. But that first generation, it was hard going for quite a few years. But even in that, Allah broke down those barriers and we started crossing those tribal lines and saying, "Hey, I go over Atlanta Masjid, hey, I like it over here. It's cool, da 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 da. I like this. I got to know the sisters." And they say, "Oh, you're from the West End? I don't know what I thought of the West End, but you're really nice." And I'm like, "Well, thank you, And same thing, I remember some sisters coming here from El Farouk maybe in the last 3 or 4 years and came to Islamic Center and said, "This is nice and your bathroom is pretty." And I'm like, "Okay." So you never know what the preconceived notions are of people, and they still are carried forth, but because you all are going to college together and going to school together and interacting together and the MSAs and all of this, you're getting to know one another, and you really are the culmination of our dreams of when we started back in the 70s.
Now, it's very interesting to see how West End played a bit of a limbo between the tensions of background, between the background differences and as well as cultural differences. I wanted to know now, what role or influence did the nation actually play in the West End? And did that cause any tension amongst the Muslims here?
Because, we had some people in the West End in that first generation who made the transition from the Nation of Islam to the Sunnah, and so they came to the West End. We had some people who made the transition from the Nation of Islam to through the transitions that Imam Warif Deen was making within the community, and who felt that they weren't moving fast enough and they came to the West End. But in general, tensions, no, I wouldn't say any tensions. Imam Jamil respected everybody, and he taught us to respect everybody, that everyone comes to this deen from a different way, but in the end, it is the fact that we are all Muslims that make us one, and that he used to always say that it's not blood that determines brotherhood, it is those who practice the same. And so, no, I would say there wasn't any tension, but like I said, there was a slight case of superiority that, we did not have a transition. We didn't come from the transition of this, from Marcus Garvey to Nation of Islam to Warif Deen Muhammad. We just came straight to the Sunnah, that somehow I think there was a slight air of superiority, but then every community had this slight air of superiority. Atlanta Masjid had this slight area of superiority because they had made the transition and they had such numbers of people who were devout and participatory in their community. And then El Farouk Masjid had people who had come to America and are still practicing their Islam. You don't know how many immigrants came to America and just like, whoo, this is over with. I'm in America, I'm free now. So, each had their own air of superiority. But as far as tension, I don't think there was any tension. It was more being separated, but it's tension because we interacted a lot. Probably the most tension was between the West End and El Farouk. And that was only not because of the leadership, because Imam Jamil, they had the Majlis where, all of the imams sat together and made plans for the Eid and so on and so forth. But when we went over there, we weren't welcomed. I remember at one point before, now you see all the masjids in Atlanta, they all have iftars every night. That wasn't always the way it was. And I remember the first time we started thinking about iftars, every masjid would host an iftar on the weekend. Okay, and that's how it first started. Every masjid would host an iftar on the weekend. And when it was our turn to host, no one from Al Farouk Masjid came to the West End. And we had a few people from Atlanta. And by that time, it was Mu'Minun was also here, Masjid al-Mu'Minun. So it was 4 weekends. There were 4 masjids in Atlanta. And then we would go down to El Farouk Masjid when it was their weekend, and they had 2 lines. There was a line for people who were part of El Farouk, and there was a line for guests. And so we said, okay. They said, no, our guests are special. And they would tell us, our guests are special, our guests are special. And we're fasting, we go get our food, and we notice we have rice and curry sauce and a piece of pita bread. And the people on the other line had lamb and vegetables and what have you. And people got mad. And I said, you can't get mad because it has to be someone who starts the interaction. And like, Mu'Mina, we don't have your demeanor. This is wrong. And people started speaking up about it. And that is actually when they made the transition to, during the iftars, just putting plates out on the table and then anyone, you go sit at any plate, because there were a lot of complaints. And they saw nothing wrong with that. They saw nothing wrong with having 2 lines, And so I think having your feelings hurt, really having your feelings hurt, being treated like that, and having come from a tradition of discrimination and Jim Crow and all of that, and coming into Islam feeling that Islam was the leveler, of everything, and then being treated like that by a group of Muslims was a problem. But at some point they realized, I guess they got enough complaints about it, and people were like putting their plates down and stomping out, and it was just really awful. But what gets to me is the fact that they didn't see anything wrong with that. They didn't see anything wrong with that. So I would say the greatest tension was probably between the African American communities, no matter which way they came, and the immigrant community, because there had to be a transition where they realized that we were all Muslim, and at that time in the 80s, we were not accepted that way.
Okay, now what about what about the nation itself that has not, those who have not made the transition or remain within the nation? Was there a presence of the nation in the West End? What influence or role did they play?
A presence, I guess it depends on what you mean by presence. We've always had contact because there were people who came from the nation. We've always had contact with them. Like right now, Brother Sabir, who is on the Majlis board of our masjid, he came from the nation. He actually goes over there and does kubbars. Okay, so we have a relationship with them. You know, we have a good relationship with them, and we've always had a good relationship with them, but they've always respected our ways, and we've respected theirs. But it wasn't any tension or anything, no, because, like I said, because so many people came through that avenue, it was like cousins, you know, those are your cousins over there, you know, maybe the cousins that you don't want to visit too much, but those are your cousins over there, and we understood them, and they understood us.
Concluded with just a couple of questions about the early history of the West End community. And if you could tell us the official name of the community of Imam Jamil, and a lot of the history books say it actually was a continuation of Dar al-Islam, so could you speak about that?
We are the community masjid, and and he named it the community masjid. That's it. He said it didn't have to be in Arabic. That is it. We are the community masjid. We call the West End Masjid, the community masjid in the West End, but our official name is basically the community masjid. Imam Jamil had a national ummah of different communities all over the country who were joined together under his leadership. And those communities were the remnants of the Dar al-Islam movement. Now, I should know a lot about the Dar al-Islam movement because I was Muslim during that time, but my total focus during that time was not politics or movements, it was raising my children as Muslim. So I really can't tell you a lot about the movement except that they were Muslims over the country who practiced the Sunnah. They came together and said we have to have a way of teaching our ummah about Islam, and they developed a methodology of the fundamental teachings of Islam. They developed a methodology of security, of how to secure your masjid, and how the brothers should be a source of security, and how the sisters should be a source of knowledge for the children. And so it was a methodology that consciously I wasn't aware of, but I was a part of because it was how my community was structured. And when the Dar movement broke up, those communities came under the leadership of Imam Jamil. And they're still connected today.
And moving towards the conclusion, what year did Imam Jamil establish the masjid? And some people I interviewed actually said there was a masjid before the official community masjid. So could you speak to that? Was there actually a masjid before Imam Jamil came down? Was there another community before the current community that we have today was established?
Okay, when I came here, the community masjid was already established. And that was in, like I said, my husband moved here. It was in '79 when I first came to Atlanta. Sometime in the early '70s, a group of African American brothers decided to establish a masjid, and they decided that they wanted to establish it in the West End for many reasons. One of the reasons was that it was accessible to everyone. You know, they could have established it in different places, and a lot of them, a number of them lived in the suburbs. They could have established it anywhere, but they said the West End, via MARTA and the bus and downtown and what have you, was a very accessible area. because it was always different economic levels here. Anyone could be comfortable living here, depending, regardless of your economic status, because like I said, we had the poor, the working class, and the professional class here. And as a matter of fact, the building that they got was the building that's directly across from the masjid that we have now. And I don't know how long that group endured. I think it was a year or two before the other people. And Imam Jamil was one of the brothers who was involved in this, okay? But he wasn't the imam, but he was one of the brothers who was involved in this. And for some reason, that broke apart. But he stayed here and he got the building across the street, and he continued what they had built the foundation of, the reason that they came together and what they wanted to see happen and all of that. He continued that. And so actually, yes, West End started before then with those 3 or 4 brothers who came together, and then and then Imam Jamil continued it.
And finally, my question to really kind of bring to a conclusion this wonderful conversation, alhamdulillah, is, and we haven't really had a chance to talk about the impact of the incarceration of Imam Jamil on the community, but given the history of the West End community, the early tensions with Al Farouk, the fact that West End succeeded probably with relatively fewer resources in having a school and sending children out to be productive and with a lot of accomplishments, what do you see moving forward, say in the next 10 years, the future of the West End community? How do you see it?
How do I see the future of the West End community? Allahu Alam, because I couldn't have envisioned what we've done thus far, so I have no idea what it can be in the future. The incarceration of Imam Jamil was something that broke our hearts, but it was also something that we were prepared for. And if my children used to laugh because when they would tell people that our phones are tapped. Everyone's phone in the West End is tapped. And they're like, what do you mean your phones are tapped? And I used to tell my parents, my phones are tapped. Our phones were tapped. I mean, they never let up on Imam Jamil. They never somehow they did not forgive him for not dying during the civil rights movement. They shot him and he was supposed to die, and he didn't die. And they put him in jail and he was supposed to die, and he didn't die. And so they were always watching us. And there'd be times at Juma that, some federal agency would be out taking pictures of the license plates of cars. And I remember my husband used to go run home and get a camera and start taking pictures of them, and then they would get in their cars and drive away. We were always under surveillance. And so we knew that they were always after him. When young men in the West End would get arrested, and they would come and say, Imam Jamil, they told me that, they would let me out if we can tell them something about you, something bad about you, So they were always after him. So when he was finally arrested, it was a time of great sadness, but it was almost like we were prepared for it, because for 20 years or so, they had been trying to get him, stopping him, federal agents stopping him for traffic violations. When do you get a federal agent stopping you for a traffic violation? And it was all kinds of things. But Imam Jamil is strong, and I just remember when he was first incarcerated here in Atlanta, and they put him in isolation, and they put him in the isolation ward. They had skinheads, and they said, we're going to get him, we're going to put him amongst people who hate African Americans and hate Muslims and hate everything. And the skinheads took Shahada. They took Shahada. And so they said, okay, we have to keep him away from people. And so the only people he'll have any contact with are his guards. And a couple of his guards took Shahada. So then they start rotating the guards so no one would be around him. So he feels that, he's in a place where Allah placed him to do some good, and we want him back. And they are appealing his case and what have you. And we hope that, inshallah, that, Allah allows him to come out from that condition, but Islam, he's giving dawah, he's making salah, he's writing, so he's always strong in that Allah placed me here for a reason. So I've never, because I talked to his wife often, and when he was in Atlanta and he was able to make phone calls, he would call the house, and the first thing he would say was, "Assalamu alaikum, Sis Mu'Mina, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do for you?" Like, is there anything he can do for me? He's incarcerated, and he's asking me, but that is who he is. And so, he feels that Allah placed him there for a reason. And so I look at the foundation of the West End came out of what he envisioned, what he saw as Islamic practice, and wanted to establish here. And it is still established here. People come through, they love the atmosphere, they love the ambiance, they love being in the West End. If I had something that I would want them to stay a little longer. I tend to see that maybe they use the West End as their you have your starter house, and then you get your next house as their starter community. But then they always come back because they want a little more of this. They want to, because you don't see this anywhere else. So as the future of the West End, I would think that, the young adults will come in and start taking over for the graybeards, because you all have accomplished so much more. We wanted you to learn your Salat and learn to read Arabic and what have you. And you all have gone overseas and learned, and you've, memorized Quran, and you've gotten ijazah, and you have so much more knowledge because we didn't realize the world was going to open up so quickly, for you guys. And so I just can't see, I can't even envision what it can be, because what has come about thus far was something I couldn't envision. So I would like to think that, all of you who have come together, who are practicing your Islam, who are studying, who have the knowledge, will take root in a community, whether it be our community or any other community, and stay and grow, so that your children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will still be practicing Islam here in Atlanta.
Thank you so much. May Allah bless you. We really appreciate this.
You're welcome. Alhamdulillah.